Hey everyone, so in this video we're going to be talking about how to get into law school without actually taking the LSAT. Now, for those of you who are based in North America, primarily in the United States, you'll find that LSAT scores are actually a very important and critical part to your law school admissions package. In fact, a lot of people speculate that the LSAT scores are actually the most important component to your admissions package. However, that is something that is very speculative, might not necessarily be the case, particularly where you're going to be applying to or if it's true at all. Now, one of the things to actually consider is the fact that the LSAT itself is actually a very unique test in that it's very skills based as opposed to being content rich. And so, if you were to look at other admissions tests like the SATs, for example, or even the MCAT or the GRE or the GMAT, whereas they tend to have a very strong emphasis on the actual content that you'll need to know to do well on the test, the LSAT's a little bit different in that it's very much challenging students into how they can actually think and form logical reasoning and get through puzzles. And so it's very much based on the skills that you can perhaps help strengthen, but might not necessarily be inherently very good at. And so for this reason, this has actually acted as a barrier for a lot of people who would actually be very competitive law school students, but weren't able to actually crack the LSAT to get into a school that they're hoping to get into. Now, one of the other things to also consider as fact is the LSAT is actually only applicable to students who are going to law school. And so there's a lot of candidates from very unique backgrounds who might be open to going to graduate school and they're maybe not sure of what area they'd like to go in the future. Devoting a lot of time, money, and resources into studying for the LSAT is actually going to narrow what they can actually apply to in the future. So a lot of students will actually study for the GRE as an example because it opens up a variety of other doors for them as well if they're unsure of what path they want to take a few years into the future. One thing to keep in mind is that a lot of these standardized tests, particularly for graduate school, do have a number of years in which they're valid. So a lot of students will take them somewhere in their undergraduate degree. If you're an older student, maybe you're taking it after you actually after you actually graduate from your program. So there's a number of different points in which students actually decide to take the tests. But we find that students who come from a variety of different backgrounds might overlook the LSAT, particularly if they didn't have their ambitions set towards law school anyways. And so a lot of law schools are actually looking at how they can actually diversify the student body and how they can actually bring in people with different backgrounds and have a diversity of thought within the actual law school program. Perhaps being able to attract students who otherwise wouldn't actually look at law school or have overlooked it because of the element that they can't actually get into it because they haven't actually taken the LSAT. And so a lot of schools have actually started to accept the GRE scores. And so this is very significant, particularly if you come from a STEM background and you have a very strong quantitative background. This is also very true depending on what country you're coming from. If you're an international candidate and maybe you need to take the LSAT and maybe English isn't your first language and the LSAT isn't offered in your native language. And so there are some barriers for you in that respect as well. And so the GRE actually makes it a little bit more inclusive for people with very diverse backgrounds and from all over the world, but also it'll help you leverage a lot of the content background that you might have already obtained through your undergraduate degree as well. So maybe if you're a math major, a STEM major as an example, the quantitative section might be a little bit easier for you and you can focus more so on the verbal section of the exam. And of course, the GRE is offered in a variety of different languages all over the world, and it's very much standard for a lot of graduate programs in the United States, including most MBA programs as well. And so it actually opens up the doors if students aren't really sure of what direction they want to take their career in and they're halfway through their undergraduate degree. It's a great way for them to open up some options for them and kind of consider what's the best route for them in their career in the future. The other great thing about the GRE as well is the fact that the GRE will allow students who are applying to dual programs, and so combined programs. A lot of schools will combine a JD with a master's degree in another specialized area. The barrier there has been the fact that a lot of students would have to take two standardized tests. And so that would actually discourage a lot of people who might have otherwise been interested in the dual degree, but might have overlooked it because of the fact that they're missing a critical part of the actual application package. Now, whether or not it's actually worth going into a dual degree is a completely different story, and perhaps there'll be a completely separate video on that specifically. In fact, we actually touched upon this in a previous segment as well, if you want to go back and check that out as well. Now, one of the biggest things about considering this is you're probably thinking, this is this sounds great, but what law schools are actually doing this already? Well, one of the amazing things about this is that we have some of the most prestigious universities that have already kind of adopted this. And I assume that this is going to open the floodgates for a lot of other schools to also jump on board with this as well. And so as of right now, we have Harvard Law School who's actually accepting the GRE, which is absolutely monumental. Columbia University is going to be starting to accept the GRE within the next year or two as well. You've got other schools like Georgetown, Northwestern University, University of Arizona, Pace University, Wake Forest, Yeshiva Law School, Florida State. So there's a lot of great schools all over the country. Admittedly, it's not been adopted all over the United States, and so it is something that's very much exclusive to a select number of universities. But the great thing is, like I mentioned, it sort of opens the floodgates to other universities kind of jumping on board, or at least considering it as an option for their particular programs as well. I think it's really awesome that we have a good representation from T14 law schools, because there is that debate in the United States as to whether or not it's even worth going into law school if you're not getting into a T14 school. So it's great that we have T14 representation, and particularly having Harvard Law on board as well, I think is a massive stamp of approval for the GRE as well. And also, like I mentioned earlier, the fact that students who are taking this early on in their career have the ability to not necessarily choose between the LSAT and the GRE, but can actually take one and still have other options open to them as well. Perhaps they want to do a master's degree in their field of study first and then decide whether or not law school makes sense for them. It's great because they don't actually have to devote their studies to two separate admissions tests. And one of the biggest things what we find is that students will take these tests during the summer just because they don't have other studies going on at that time as well. And so a lot of the preparation that goes into this test, which is quite substantial for a lot of people, there are a lot of nuances in each of the individual admissions tests. A lot of people will actually supplement it with courses, admissions courses, whether online or in person as well, in addition to self-study as well. And that could eat up a large chunk of a student's summer. And so having to devote multiple months and maybe in multiple summer sessions to get through all of the admissions tests for grad school is something that isn't very appealing to a lot of students. And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, particularly if there's a test that might be able to quantify whether or not a student's actually going to be successful in the particular programs that they're looking at as well. And so I'm really happy that schools are looking to find a more inclusive way of actually getting students into the classroom. I think that it's an awesome way to actually not only bring people from diverse backgrounds, but to also assess people in other ways that haven't really been assessed before as well. There was always that question as to whether or not the LSAT itself was actually a good indicator of whether or not somebody would actually be successful in law school or not, or whether it was just kind of a barrier to entry. But having schools look at alternative methods similar to other programs like the MBA as an example, who exclusively use the GMAT in a lot of cases, but there's a lot of schools who've opened up the GRE as well. I know that there are still some schools that only accept the GMAT, although it is very far and few in between these days, and hopefully we see that same case happen with the LSAT as well. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about this as well. Is it something that you've actually heard of before? I'm actually going to link in the description below the full list at the LSAC website of the schools that are currently accepting the GRE. Hopefully that also gets updated as new schools are opening up to this as well. I'd love to hear your comments, questions, concerns in the comments section below. As always, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.